February 6, 1982, Concord, California. A 3-year-old girl waited in her parents' van while they exchanged a car part at an auto supply store. Her 9-year-old brother sat beside her. A man knocked on the window and said their mother wanted them. When the boy opened the door, the stranger snatched his sister, flung her over his shoulder, and ran. For 10 months, Tara Burke lived in a filthy van, subjected to horrific abuse, her blonde hair cut off and dyed brown. Then an 11-year-old boy escaped through a roof ventilator and led police back to save her. This is Tara's story. Before we begin this difficult but ultimately hopeful story, I want to ask you to do something. If cases like this matter to you, if you believe every child deserves protection and every survivor deserves justice, please hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss these important true crime investigations. And I really want to know, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below. Are you from the Bay Area and remember when this case broke? Do you work with child abuse survivors? Your engagement helps these stories reach more people and reminds us why protecting children is everyone's responsibility. Let me know where you're from. The morning of February 6, 1982, started as an ordinary Saturday for the Burke family. Steve Burke, a blind piano tuner, and his wife Elizabeth lived in what was then called West Pittsburgh, California, in the Bay Area. They had 2 children. Jeremy was 9 years old, a responsible boy who helped look after his younger sister. Tara Elizabeth Burke was 3 months shy of her 3rd birthday. She had beautiful blonde hair, brown eyes, and the trust that 3-year-olds naturally have in the world around them. Tara was still in diapers, still very much a baby despite being almost 3. Steve and Elizabeth needed to make a quick stop at an auto supply store on Clayton Road in Concord. They were exchanging a part, a simple errand that should take just a few minutes. The store was busy on Saturday morning with customers doing weekend car maintenance projects. Steve and Elizabeth faced a decision parents make constantly, whether to bring the children inside for a quick errand or leave them in the car for a few minutes. They decided to leave Jeremy and Tara in the van. Jeremy was old enough and responsible enough to watch his sister for the short time they would be inside. The van was parked right outside the store. They would be quick. Nothing could go wrong in such a short time. Jeremy and Tara sat in the van waiting for their parents. The parking lot was busy with people coming and going. Cars pulled in and out. Shoppers walked past carrying their purchases. It was a normal Saturday morning scene, the kind of ordinary moment that happens thousands of times across America with no incident. But this time was different. A man approached the van. He knocked on the window. Jeremy looked up to see a stranger standing outside. The man told Jeremy that their mother wanted them. Jeremy, trusting that his parents had sent someone to get them, opened the door. The moment Jeremy opened the door, the man lunged forward. He grabbed Tara, yanked her out of the van, and flung her over his shoulder. Tara, confused and frightened, did not have time to scream before the man was running. He raced across the parking lot toward a nearby apartment complex. Jeremy watched in shock as a stranger carried his baby sister away. A car was waiting at the apartment complex. The kidnapper reached the vehicle, jumped inside with Tara, and the car sped away. The entire abduction took seconds. Jeremy ran into the store, yelling for his parents. Steve and Elizabeth emerged to find Jeremy hysterical, Tara gone, and their worst nightmare beginning. Police were called immediately. The Concord Police Department responded within minutes. Officers took statements from Jeremy, from the parents, from witnesses in the parking lot. Some people had seen the abduction but had not realized what was happening until it was too late. The description of the kidnapper was limited. A young man, race unclear, who moved quickly and had a car waiting. The car description was vague. Jeremy could not provide detailed information because everything had happened so fast and he had been focused on his sister being taken. The investigation faced challenges from the start because there was so little concrete evidence to work with. Sergeant Dick Gordy of the Concord Police Juvenile Bureau was at home preparing for a barbecue when he received the call about the kidnapping. Gordy was 34 years old and experienced in working with crimes involving children. He had seen many difficult cases, but child abductions were particularly urgent and particularly painful. Statistics about abducted children are grim. Most children taken by strangers are killed within the first few hours. Every minute that passes reduces the chances of finding the child alive. Gordy knew he was racing against time. He abandoned his barbecue plans and headed to the scene. As he later reflected, the phone could ring and change the course of your history. That call changed Gordy's life and began his deep connection to Tara's case. The Concord Police Department mobilized quickly. Detectives were called in, a task force was organized. Officers canvassed the area, interviewed potential witnesses, and began checking registered sex offenders. The department set up a special hotline for tips. Media coverage began immediately. Local television stations broadcast Tara's description and photograph. Newspapers ran stories about the kidnapping. The community responded with shock and concern. A 3-year-old girl had been snatched from a parking lot in broad daylight. If it could happen to Tara, it could happen to any child. Parents across the Bay Area held their children closer and looked at strangers with new suspicion. Steve and Elizabeth Burke were devastated. Their quick errand had turned into a nightmare. They faced not only the terror of having their daughter missing, but also the guilt of having left her in the van, even for just a few minutes. This guilt would haunt them for years. Though any reasonable person could see they had made a decision countless parents make daily without incident. They could not have known a predator was waiting, watching, ready to strike. The Burkes cooperated fully with investigators, provided photographs of Tara, and began the agonizing wait for news. The investigation generated hundreds of tips. The special hotline rang constantly. People reported suspicious vehicles, possible sightings of Tara, information about individuals who might be involved. Each tip had to be investigated. Detectives followed up on every lead, no matter how unlikely it seemed. They worked overtime, postponing days off, driven by the knowledge that a little girl's life was at stake. But as days passed with no breakthrough, the likelihood of finding Tara alive diminished. After a week, many investigators privately believed Tara was probably dead, though no one wanted to tell her parents that statistical reality. Sergeant Gordy carried a photograph of Tara with him constantly. The image showed a beautiful little girl with blonde hair and innocent eyes, a child who should have been playing with toys and learning to talk in full sentences, not missing and presumed dead. Gordy looked at that photograph every day, reminding himself why he was working such long hours, why he could not give up, why every lead mattered. The photograph kept Tara human for Gordy, not just another case file, but a real child who needed to be found. Weeks turned into months. The initial media frenzy faded. Other news stories took precedence. The task force scaled back as investigators had to return to other cases. The special hotline still received calls, but fewer than before. Tara's case was going cold. The Burkes held on to hope, but it became harder each day. They attended vigils. They spoke to media whenever reporters were interested. They kept Tara's room exactly as she had left it. They waited. Months passed. Spring turned to summer. Summer turned to fall. Tara had been missing since February. By December, she had been gone 10 months. Most people assumed she was dead, that her body would someday be found, that her kidnapper would never be caught. But Tara was not dead. She was alive, though living in conditions so horrific that death might have seemed preferable. She was being held captive in a van parked in the industrial South of Market district of San Francisco, less than 30 miles from where she had been taken. The van belonged to Luis Robert Johnson, a 33-year-old man who would become known by his street name, Tree Frog. Johnson and his accomplice, Alex Cabarga, were subjecting Tara to abuse, so severe that the prosecutors would later describe it as a crime against civilization itself. The van where Tara spent 10 months was a 1972 step van, a delivery vehicle that Luis Johnson had converted into living quarters. The conversion was rudimentary and filthy. Johnson, known by his street name Tree Frog, lived in the van and drove it through the back streets of San Francisco's South of Market warehouse district. The area was industrial, sparsely populated at night, and generally ignored by authorities. The van blended in among other commercial vehicles. No one looked twice at it, parked on various streets throughout the district. Inside that van, Tara endured abuse so severe that prosecutors would struggle to find words adequate to describe it. Luis Robert Johnson was 33 years old when he kidnapped Tara. He had a history of inappropriate sexual interest in children. He had previously lived in Mendocino County, where he had been known in the counterculture. Communities of Boonville and Albion. Johnson had a philosophy about children that he described as liberation. He believed parents did not know how to raise children properly and that his methods were superior. This twisted ideology provided Johnson with justification for his crimes. He was not abusing children in his mind, he was liberating them from their families. This delusion allowed Johnson to commit horrific acts without experiencing the guilt that would stop most people. Alex Cabarga was 18 years old when arrested for his role in Tara's captivity. But Alex's story was more complicated than it initially appeared. Alex had been given to Tree Frog Johnson by his own mother when Alex was 9 years old. The mother said her son needed a father figure, and Johnson had volunteered. For 9 years, from age 9 to 18, Alex had lived with Johnson and been subjected to ongoing sexual abuse and physical violence. Johnson beat Alex regularly. Witnesses would later testify that Alex was completely submissive to Johnson, like a wife to a dominating husband. Alex rarely spoke out of turn. He did what Johnson told him to do because he had been conditioned through years of abuse to obey without question. The relationship between Johnson and Cabarga complicated the case against Cabarga. Was he a perpetrator or a victim? The answer was both. Alex had participated in abusing Tara. He had committed acts against her that would result in criminal charges. But he had also been a victim of Johnson for most of his childhood and adolescence. The abuse Alex endured had explained but did not excuse his participation in Tara's abuse. The legal system would have to grapple with how to hold Alex accountable while acknowledging he had also been victimized. This complexity would become more apparent during the trial and sentencing phases of the case. Mac Lin was the 11-year-old Vietnamese refugee boy who would ultimately save Tara's life. Mac had arrived in the United States as a young refugee from Vietnam. He lived in San Francisco but lacked consistent parental guidance. He was vulnerable in ways that predators like Johnson recognized and exploited. On April 11th, 1982, 2 months after Tara's kidnapping, Johnson approached Mac with an offer. Johnson said he would pay Mac $200 a month to work as a babysitter. For a young boy with limited resources, $200 a month seemed like significant money. Mac agreed and got into the van. Once inside, he realized that he had made a terrible mistake. Johnson and Cabarga held Mac captive alongside Tara. The conditions inside the van were horrific. The vehicle was putrid, filled with garbage, and smelled of unwashed bodies and waste. Tara and Mac lived in this filth. They were beaten regularly with rubber hoses. Johnson photographed them in sexual situations, taking hundreds of Polaroid pictures and filming at least 2 pornographic movies. The abuse was systematic and relentless. Tara was forced to participate in sexual acts. When she refused or did not perform to Johnson's satisfaction, food was withheld. A 3-year-old child was starved to coerce compliance with sexual abuse. The depravity was almost incomprehensible. Johnson cut off Tara's beautiful blonde hair and dyed what remained a mousy brown color. This served multiple purposes. It changed her appearance, making her less recognizable as the missing girl whose photograph had been broadcast across California. It also symbolically stripped away part of her identity. Tara's blonde hair had been distinctive. Without it, she became less herself and more an object Johnson could control. The haircutting was both a practical measure to avoid detection and a psychological assault on Tara's sense of self. The abuse extended beyond sexual violence. Johnson forced Tara to participate in abusing Mac. He taught the 3-year-old girl to beat the 11-year-old boy with a rubber hose. This forced participation in violence had multiple effects. It created conflict between the 2 child victims, making them less likely to bond or cooperate. It implicated Tara in the abuse, potentially creating guilt and shame that would make her less likely to report what was happening. And it served Johnson's twisted purposes by breaking down normal human empathy and moral boundaries in a child who was only beginning to develop them. Tara was told she was a boy. Johnson, Cabarga, dressed her in boys' clothing and referred to her using male pronouns. This gender confusion served to further disorient and control her. A 3-year-old's sense of gender identity is still forming. By insisting she was a boy, despite her body telling her otherwise, Johnson created cognitive dissonance that made it harder for Tara to trust her own perceptions. She became dependent on her captors to define reality for her. When she was eventually rescued, Tara did not know her real name. She had forgotten she was a girl. Her identity had been systematically dismantled over 10 months of captivity. The van moved frequently. Johnson drove through the warehouse district, parking on different streets to avoid drawing attention. Sometimes the van was parked at a Mission District warehouse leased by William Marston, a convicted child molester whom Johnson had befriended. Marston later testified that the van had been parked at his warehouse for 3 months. During that time, Marston knew or strongly suspected that Tara was the missing girl from Concord, whose case had been all over the news. Johnson showed Marston 21 photographs depicting sexual activity with Tara, arranged in story order. Johnson invited Marston to come to the van and participate in abusing Tara. Marston declined, saying once was enough and he did not want to go back to jail. But Marston did not call police either, despite knowing a kidnapped child was being held 5 blocks from police headquarters. Marston's silence exemplified a broader problem. Multiple people had contact with Johnson during the time he held Tara and Mac captive. People in the counterculture communities of Mendocino County, where Johnson had previously lived, knew about his inappropriate interest in children. People saw him with Alex Cabarga over the years when Alex was a child being raised by an unrelated adult man. People in San Francisco saw the van, saw Johnson, perhaps glimpsed the children inside. But no one reported their suspicions to police. Whether out of fear, reluctance to involve authorities, or simple indifference, the adults, who might have rescued Tara and Mac sooner, chose silence instead. Macklin endured 8 months of captivity before finding a way to escape. He watched for opportunities. He observed the routines. He waited for the right moment. On December 18, 1982, 10 months after Tara's kidnapping and 8 months after Mac's abduction, that moment arrived. The van was parked in the China Basin area of San Francisco. Johnson and Cabarga were occupied elsewhere in the van. Mac climbed through a roofine ventilator, squeezed his body through the small opening, and dropped to the ground outside. He ran to a nearby house where he knew someone. He told them he had been held prisoner. He begged them to call police. They did. Mac led police back to the van. Officers broke through the doors and found Tara lying on a mattress with Cabarga, both of them naked below the waist. Tara was rescued. The nightmare was over, though its effects would last far longer than the 10 months of captivity. The rescue happened on December 18, 1982, a cold winter day in San Francisco. When police broke into the van and found Tara, she was terrified. She did not understand that these men with badges were there to help her. For 10 months, the only adults in her life had been Johnson and Cabarga, both of whom had hurt her repeatedly. The concept of rescue, of safety, of people who would protect rather than harm her, had been erased from her experience. Police described Tara as very quiet and frightened to death of everything. She huddled under a blanket, naked below the waist, unable to comprehend that her ordeal was ending. Tara and Mac were both taken to a children's center for examination and treatment. They had bruises from the beatings they had endured. Tara was malnourished, having been denied food as punishment for not complying with sexual demands. Both children showed signs of severe trauma beyond the physical injuries. The medical staff who examined them were horrified by what had been done to these children. Tara spent a day in protective custody while authorities worked to confirm her identity. She had been missing for 10 months. Her appearance had changed dramatically. Her blonde hair was gone, dyed brown. She was older, having spent those 10 months growing from a 2-year-old into a 3-year-old. Authorities needed to be certain this child was actually Tara Burke before notifying her parents. Sergeant Dick Gordy received the phone call he had been hoping for, but had almost stopped believing would come. A girl matching Tara's description had been found. Gordy had worked Tara's case for 10 months, carrying her photograph with him daily. following every lead no matter how unlikely, maintaining hope even when statistics suggested she was almost certainly dead. Now there was a chance she was alive. Gordy did not want to tell the Burkes until he was absolutely certain. He had seen their suffering for 10 months. He could not raise their hopes only to crush them if this child turned out not to be Tara. Gordy went to the Children's Center to see the girl himself. The moment Gordy saw her, he knew. Despite the changed hair color, despite the trauma visible in her eyes, despite 10 months of growth and suffering, Gordy recognized Tara from the photograph he had carried. This was the Burkes' missing daughter. San Francisco. Authorities confirmed the identification through other means, comparing the child to detailed descriptions from the missing persons report. The child had distinctive features that matched Tara's description. The timing fit. Everything pointed to this being Tara Burke. Gordy called the Burkes with news that seemed impossible. Their daughter had been found alive. Steve and Elizabeth Burke rushed to San Francisco. The reunion was emotional and complicated. Tara did not recognize her parents at first. She stared at the floor, refusing to make eye contact. Elizabeth showed Tara a photograph of herself before the kidnapping. She asked Tara who it was. Tara looked at the photo and said, "That's me." Then Elizabeth showed Tara the family portrait, pointing out each person and identifying them. Gradually, Tara began to warm up. Recognition dawned. These were her real parents, the people from before the van, before Johnson and Cabarga, before the nightmare. Tara was reunited with her family on December 19, 1982, just days before Christmas. The Burkes took Tara home to West Pittsburgh. The reunion was joyful but also challenging. Tara had been through 10 months of severe trauma. She had nightmares. She woke up screaming. She was frightened of men. She did not understand that she was safe now, that the bad men could not hurt her anymore. For the first 6 months after her rescue, Tara slept in her parents' bed. She could not bear to be alone. The darkness terrified her. Strange sounds sent her into panic. She clung to her mother and father, desperate for the reassurance that they would not leave her again, that no one would take her away. Jeremy, Tara's older brother, struggled with complicated feelings. He was overjoyed to have his sister back. He had blamed himself for opening the van door when the stranger knocked and said their mother wanted them. For 10 months, Jeremy had carried guilt for his role in Tara's kidnapping, even though any reasonable person could see that a 9-year-old boy was not responsible for a predator's actions. Jeremy Haven had been lied to and manipulated just as surely as Tara had been taken. But children often blame themselves for things beyond their control. Jeremy needed therapy to work through his guilt and to adjust to having Tara back, but changed by her experiences. The entire Burke family entered therapy. Steve and Elizabeth had suffered 10 months of not knowing whether their daughter was alive or dead. They had faced suspicion from some investigators early in the case. They had dealt with media attention. They had lived in a state of suspended grief, unable to mourn because there was still hope, unable to move forward because Tara was missing. Now that Tara was home, they had to help her heal while also addressing their own trauma. The family therapy was intensive and ongoing. They learned how to help Tara feel safe, how to respond to her nightmares, how to rebuild trust that had been shattered. Steve Burke's career as a piano tuner suffered after Tara's return. Steve was blind, which meant he worked in clients' homes tuning their pianos. After the widespread publicity about Tara's case and the horrific details that emerged during the investigation and trial, some customers became reluctant to have Steve in their houses. The reluctance was irrational and unfair. Steve was the victim's father, not a perpetrator. But people's discomfort with the case and its sexual nature led them to distance themselves from the Burke family. Steve's income dropped. The family faced financial difficulties on top of everything else. They were in danger of losing their home at one point because of the lost income. Louis Johnson's and Alex Cabarga were arrested immediately after Tara's rescue. They were charged with a staggering array of crimes. The initial charges included 113 sex crimes against Tara and Mac. Johnson faced 112 of those counts, including 16 counts of sodomy by force, 10 counts of rape, 30 counts of forcible oral copulation, and 56 counts of lewd and lascivious conduct with a child by force. Johnson was also charged with kidnapping, 15 counts of felonious assault, and conspiracy. Cabarga, being 18 years old, could be tried as an adult. He faced 1 count of lewd and lascivious conduct with a child by force. Both men were charged jointly with false imprisonment. The charges would eventually expand. By the time the case went to trial, Johnson and Cabarga faced 193 criminal counts stemming from their abuse of Tara and Mac. The sheer number of charges reflected the systematic nature of the abuse. Each act of sexual violence, each beating, each instance of forced participation in pornography was a separate crime. Prosecutors were determined to hold both men accountable for every documented instance of harm they had inflicted on the children. The case file grew enormous as investigators compiled evidence. The physical evidence seized from the van was overwhelming and disturbing. Police confiscated 2 pornographic movies showing Tara being abused. They found hundreds of Polaroid photographs depicting sexual acts with both Tara and Mac. The photographs were arranged in story order, documenting the progression of abuse. They found the equipment used to beat the children. They found the filthy conditions the children had lived in. Every piece of evidence painted a picture of sustained, deliberate, sadistic abuse of 2 vulnerable children over many months. District Attorney Arlo Smith announced he would seek the maximum possible sentences. Smith described the case as one of the most disturbing he had encountered in his career. The district attorney's office assigned experienced prosecutors to handle the case. They knew the trial would be difficult. Using child witnesses, especially children as young as Tara, presented challenges. The defense would argue that the children's testimony was unreliable, that they had been coached, that their memories were inaccurate. Prosecutors needed the physical evidence to corroborate what Tara and Mac would say on the witness stand. The community response to Tara's rescue was relief mixed with horror. People were glad Tara had been found alive, but the details emerging about what she had endured were almost too terrible to process. A dozen Concord police detectives had worked overtime for 10 months, checking out more than 1,500 tips. The community had rallied to search for Tara. Now they learned she had been alive the entire time, held captive and abused in a van parked in San Francisco, less than 30 miles from where she had been taken. The proximity made it somehow worse. Tara had been so close geographically but so far beyond anyone's reach. The case prompted discussions about child safety, about how to protect children from predators, about the signs that might indicate abuse is occurring. Parents became more vigilant. Teachers and social workers received training on recognizing abuse. The system was learning, though the lessons came at a terrible cost. The trial of Louis Tree Frog Johnson and Alex Cabarga began in late 1983, nearly a year after Tara's rescue. The proceedings attracted significant media attention. Reporters filled the courtroom. The public followed developments closely. Judge Robert Dosset presided over the case. He would later describe Tara's ordeal as a crime not just against the Burke family and MacLynn, but against civilization itself. The trial would reveal details so disturbing that even hardened legal professionals were shaken. MacLynn testified about the abuse he and Tara had endured. At 12 years old, Mac took the witness stand and described being lured into the van with promises of payment for babysitting. He described the beatings with rubber hoses. He described being forced to participate in sexual acts. He described watching Tara being abused and being powerless to protect her. He described the fear, the hunger, the filth, and the desperation that characterized life in the van. Mac's testimony was crucial because Tara was too young to testify effectively. At 3 years old when rescued and 4 by the time of trial, Tara could not provide the detailed courtroom testimony needed to secure convictions. Mac was older and could articulate what had happened. His testimony, combined with the overwhelming physical evidence, built a case that was nearly impossible for the defense to counter. Defense attorneys faced an uphill battle. The physical evidence was damning. Hundreds of photographs, 2 pornographic movies, the testimony of MacLynn, the medical evidence of abuse, the testimony of witnesses who had seen or heard things related to the case. Defense attorneys could not credibly claim their clients were innocent. Instead, they focused on mitigation, on explaining circumstances that might lead to less severe sentences, on portraying the defendants as damaged people rather than pure evil. Alex Cabarga's defense was particularly complex. His attorney argued that Alex was as much a victim as a perpetrator. Alex had been given to Tree Frog Johnson at age 9 by his own mother. For 9 years, Johnson had abused Alex physically and sexually. Alex had been conditioned to obey Johnson without question. Witnesses testified that Alex was completely submissive to Johnson, like a dominated spouse in an abusive relationship. Alex rarely spoke unless spoken to. He did what Johnson told him to do. His participation in abusing Tara, while criminal, occurred in the context of his own ongoing victimization. The defense did not claim this absolved Alex of responsibility, but it provided context for understanding how an 18-year-old could participate in such horrific crimes. The prosecution did not dispute that Alex had been victimized by Johnson, but they argued that being a victim does not give someone license to victimize others. Alex had choices, even if those choices were constrained by his circumstances. He could have refused to participate in abusing Tara. He could have helped Mac escape sooner. He could have gone to police himself. Instead, Alex chose to remain with Johnson and to participate in the abuse of 2 children. Those choices had consequences, and those consequences needed to include criminal punishment. The tension between acknowledging Alex as a victim while also holding him accountable as a perpetrator would persist throughout the trial and sentencing. Louis Johnson's defense was weaker. Johnson had no comparable claim to being a victim himself. He was a 34-year-old man who had deliberately kidnapped children and subjected them to sustained abuse. His twisted ideology about liberating children from their families did not constitute a defense. If anything, it made him more dangerous because it showed he had rationalized his crimes and would likely continue committing them if given the opportunity. Johnson's defense attorneys could not offer much beyond asking for mercy, which seemed absurd given what their client had done. William Marston testified under a grant of immunity from prosecution. Marston admitted he had suspected the girl in the van was the missing Tara Burke. He admitted Johnson had shown him photographs of sexual abuse. He admitted Johnson had invited him to participate in abusing Tara, and he admitted he had not called police, even though doing so might have rescued Tara months earlier. Marston's testimony provided crucial details about the conditions in the van, about Johnson's attitudes and statements, and about the timeline of where the van had been parked. But Marston's failure to report what he knew when he knew it meant he bore some moral responsibility for Tara's continued suffering. The prosecution's decision to grant him an immunity in exchange for testimony was pragmatic, but left many observers feeling that Marston had gotten away with complicity in child abuse. The trial revealed the extent of Johnson's predatory behavior before kidnapping Tara. Witnesses from Mendocino County testified about Johnson's history in their communities. They described his inappropriate interest in children, his philosophy about liberating them from parents, his relationship with Alex Cabarga that began when Alex was 9. The testimony painted a picture of a serial predator who had operated for years without being stopped. The failure of authorities and community members to intervene earlier had allowed Johnson to escalate from grooming and abusing Alex to kidnapping and abusing Tara and Mac. Each failure to act, each decision to remain silent, each moment when someone suspected something wrong but did nothing had contributed to enabling Johnson's crimes. The pornographic materials seized from the van were not shown to the public, but descriptions of them entered the court record. 2 movies showed Tara being subjected to sexual abuse. Hundreds of photographs depicted both children in various states of undress and in sexual situations. The materials were arranged like a story, documenting the progression of abuse. The existence of this material served multiple purposes for Johnson. It provided him with gratification, it documented his control over the children, and it potentially could have been sold or distributed to other pedophiles, though there was no evidence Johnson had done so. The materials were physical proof of crimes that might otherwise have been difficult to prove, especially given Tara's young age and limited ability to testify. In January 1984, the jury returned guilty verdicts on virtually all counts. Johnson was convicted of 193 counts of sexual abuse, kidnapping, and related charges. Cabarga was also convicted, though on fewer counts reflecting his different level of involvement. The convictions brought relief to the Burke family and to Mac Lynn, who had been placed in foster care. Justice was being served. The men who had caused so much suffering would face consequences. But the Burke family knew that no sentence could undo what had happened to Tara. No amount of prison time would erase her trauma or restore her lost innocence. Judge Dawsey scheduled sentencing hearings. Before imposing sentences, the judge heard victim impact statements. Steve and Elizabeth Burke addressed the court, describing the 10 months of agony when Tara was missing, the trauma of having her returned damaged and terrified, and the ongoing challenges the family faced. Steve described losing piano tuning clients because of discomfort with the case, putting the family at risk of losing their home. Elizabeth described Tara's nightmares, her fear, her inability to be alone. She described the entire family being in therapy and the financial strain of paying for that therapy. The Burkes asked Judge Dawsey to impose the maximum possible sentences to ensure Johnson and Cabarga could never harm another child. Judge Dawsey's sentencing hearing on January 20, 1984, would become a moment of judicial condemnation of crimes that shocked the conscience of the community. The judge had reviewed the evidence. He had heard the testimony. He understood the full scope of what Johnson and Cabarga had done. When he imposed sentence on Louis Tree Frog Johnson, Judge Dawsey did not hold back. He sentenced Johnson to 527 years in state prison. The sentence was consecutive on many counts, ensuring that even with good behavior credits, Johnson would spend the rest of his natural life in prison. The 527-year sentence was symbolic as well as practical. It represented the magnitude of Johnson's crimes, the number of times he had violated these children, the sustained nature of his abuse. Alex Cabarga was remanded to the California Youth Authority for psychological evaluation. Judge Dawsey scheduled Cabarga's sentencing for March 28, 1984, giving time for the evaluation to be completed. The judge wanted expert assessment of Cabarga's mental state, his level of culpability given his own victimization, and his likelihood of reoffending. The delay in Cabarga's sentencing reflected the complexity of his case. When Cabarga returned for sentencing 2 months later, he received 200 years in prison. The sentence was less than Johnson's, but still ensured Cabarga would spend most, if not all, of his adult life incarcerated. The sentence acknowledged that Cabarga had been a victim, but held him accountable for choosing to victimize others rather than seeking help or escape. The sentences brought a measure of closure to the criminal proceedings. Johnson and Cabarga would be imprisoned for the rest of their lives. They would never again have access to children. The community could rest assured these particular predators had been removed from society permanently. But for Tara and her family, the ordeal was far from over. The criminal trial was complete, but the recovery process was just beginning. Tara's recovery process began immediately after her rescue but would continue for years. The first challenge was helping a 3-year-old child understand that she was safe, that the bad men could not hurt her anymore, that her parents would protect her. For a child who had spent 10 months believing adults existed only to cause pain, rebuilding trust required patience and consistency. The Burke family enrolled Tara in therapy almost immediately. California had a Victims of Violent Crime program that provided funding for counseling. Tara qualified for up to $10,000 in therapy services. The family used every cent of that allocation over the first few years after her rescue. The $10,000 limit proved woefully inadequate. Tara needed intensive, ongoing therapy to process what had happened to her. She needed help with nightmares and anxiety. She needed support in developing a sense of safety. She needed assistance in understanding her experiences in age-appropriate ways as she grew older. The therapy costs far exceeded the available funding. The Burke family paid out of pocket for additional sessions, straining their already tight finances. Elizabeth Burke complained to state officials that Tara had received only $10,000, while Alex Cabarga, one of her abusers, was entitled to draw from a $10,000 fund set up for him under the Crime Victims Law to pay for psychiatric care while serving his prison sentence. The Board of Control had ruled that Cabarga was also a victim of Johnson and thus entitled to victim services. The injustice of the funding situation enraged the Burke family. Tara, the innocent child who had been kidnapped and abused, received limited funding for therapy. Alex Cabarga, who had participated in abusing her, received funding for therapy while in prison. The law at the time Tara was kidnapped capped victim services at $10,000. Legislation passed later increased the cap to $46,000, but those increases did not apply retroactively to Tara's case. She was stuck with the $10,000 limit. State officials acknowledged the situation was unfortunate but said they were bound by the law as it existed when the crime occurred. They could not make exceptions even for cases as serious as Tara's. The funding issues created stress for the Burke family. Without adequate therapy, Tara began to regress. The progress she had made started to erode. Her nightmares increased, her anxiety worsened, her ability to function in daily life declined. With more therapy, the regression stopped and she began improving again. But the family could not always afford the therapy she needed. The financial strain of paying for therapy while also dealing with Steve Burke's reduced income created a crisis. The family felt abandoned by a system that had failed to protect Tara and now was failing to help her recover. State Senator Dan Boatwright heard about the Burke family's plight and tried to help. He investigated whether exceptions could be made to increase Tara's funding. He lobbied the Board of Control to reconsider their position. But the bureaucratic answer remained the same. The law as it existed when Tara was kidnapped limited her to $10,000, and no provisions existed for reviewing cases from previous time periods to award more money. Boatwright's efforts highlighted the arbitrary and often cruel nature of bureaucratic rules. The system was more concerned with following procedures than with helping a child who had suffered horrific abuse. As Tara grew older, new challenges emerged. She enrolled in school under her mother's maiden name initially. The Burke family wanted to protect Tara from being recognized and treated differently because of what had happened to her. They wanted her to have as normal a childhood as possible. But in 5th grade, Tara decided to use her own name again. She was tired of hiding. She was learning that what happened to her was not her fault and not something to be ashamed of. Using her real name was a step toward reclaiming her identity and refusing to let the kidnapping define her completely. Some of Tara's classmates and their parents knew who she was once she started using her real name. The Tara Burke kidnapping case had been major news in the Bay Area. Parents remembered the story. Some people asked Tara why she still talked about the kidnapping years later. They told her it was over and she should move on. These comments reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of trauma. Trauma does not simply end when the traumatic event ends. The effects persist, sometimes for a lifetime. Talking about what happened was part of Tara's healing process, not an inability to move on. But explaining this to people who had not experienced severe trauma was difficult. Throughout Tara's childhood and adolescence, Sergeant Dick Gordy remained a constant presence in her life. Gordy had carried Tara's photograph through 10 months of investigation. He had been the one to confirm her identity after rescue. He had testified at trial. After the criminal case concluded, Gordy did not forget about Tara. He checked in with the family regularly. He maintained a relationship with Tara as she grew up. Gordy became like a second father to her, a police officer who had dedicated himself to finding her and now dedicated himself to helping her thrive. Gordy's continued involvement made a significant difference in Tara's recovery. She knew there was someone outside her immediate family who cared about her welfare and wanted to see her succeed. Mac Lynn's fate after the rescue was different from Tara's. Mac had been placed in foster care because his family could not provide adequate supervision and guidance. Mac had saved Tara's life by escaping and leading police back to the van. The city of Concord recognized his heroism by establishing a trust fund of over $11,000 for Mac. The money would be held until he turned 18, then given to him with accumulated interest. $1,000 of the reward money was split between 2 women Mac had run to after escaping, women who had called police and ensured help arrived. The community wanted to honor Mac's bravery and provide some support for his future. But Mac faced his own trauma from the 8 months he spent in captivity. He had been beaten, sexually abused, and forced to participate in abuse of Tara. His testimony at trial had required him to relive those experiences in a public courtroom. Like Tara, Mac needed extensive therapy. Like Tara, Mac faced the challenge of rebuilding trust and developing a sense of safety. Mac's situation was complicated by his status as a refugee and by his family circumstances. He did not have the strong parental support that Tara had. Foster care provided stability, but it was not the same as having biological parents who were fully invested in his recovery. Mac's long-term outcomes received less public attention than Tara's, leaving questions about how well he healed from his trauma. Tara's story began appearing on national television programs about missing children. Her case was featured on shows that highlighted successful recoveries and educated parents about child safety. Tara's photograph from before the kidnapping, the one Gordy had carried, became a symbol of hope. She had been found alive after 10 months. She was healing. The message was that even in cases that seemed hopeless, recovery was possible. These media appearances served dual purposes. They provided hope to families of missing children, and they kept child safety issues in public consciousness, potentially preventing future abductions through increased awareness and vigilance. By the late 1980s, Tara was in elementary school and making progress. The nightmares had decreased in frequency, though they never completely stopped. She still had moments of fear and anxiety, but she had learned coping strategies through therapy. She had friends. She enjoyed school. She participated in normal childhood activities. The Burke family had established routines that helped Tara feel secure. But underneath the surface stability, Tara carried scars that would never fully heal. She had lost her early childhood to captivity and abuse. She had developed an awareness of human cruelty that children should never have to acquire. Her innocence had been stolen in ways that could not be restored. The financial struggles continued. Even after the initial therapy funding ran out and Tara's condition began to deteriorate, the family scraped together money to resume counseling when the law was amended to provide additional funding. Therapy became a long-term commitment, not a short-term intervention. Tara would be in therapy, on and off, for years, working through different layers of trauma as she matured and gained new understanding of what had been done to her. Each developmental stage brought new challenges. Understanding abuse as a young child is different from understanding it as an adolescent or an adult. Tara would need support at each stage of development to integrate her experiences in age-appropriate ways. Sergeant Gordy's relationship with Tara deepened over the years. He saw her regularly. He checked on her progress. He made sure she had resources she needed. When Tara expressed interest in attending college, Gordy became instrumental in making that happen. He worked with the Concord Police Officers Association to raise money for Tara's education. He reached out to local businesses asking for support. His advocacy for Tara went far beyond his professional duties. Gordy's commitment stemmed partly from his investment in her case during those 10 months she was missing and partly from genuine care for Tara as a person. He wanted to see her not just survive, but thrive, to have opportunities that might have seemed impossible given what she had endured. By 1997, 15 years after her rescue, Tara Burke was 18 years old and preparing to enter college. The transformation from the terrified 3-year-old found in a van to a young woman ready to pursue higher education was remarkable. Tara had not only survived her trauma but was determined to build a life beyond it. She had graduated from high school. She had developed interests and aspirations. She was looking forward to attending San Jose State University. The butterflies that Tara cherished as her personal symbol represented this transformation. Butterflies emerged from cocoons, transformed into something beautiful. Tara saw her own journey reflected in that metamorphosis. Sergeant Dick Gordy, now Lieutenant Gordy, of the Concord Police Department, remained actively involved in Tara's life. He helped her apply to San Jose State. He worked with the Police Officers Association to raise scholarship money for her tuition and expenses. He connected her with a Concord businessman who donated a red Mustang for Tara to drive. Gordy had become like a second father to Tara, someone she loved and trusted. She had written him a letter expressing gratitude for what he had given her financially and emotionally, thanking him for the effort and love he had shown. The bond between Tara and Gordy was remarkable, demonstrating that healing from trauma often requires not just professional help, but also personal relationships with people who genuinely care. Most weekends, Tara drove her red Mustang to Martinez to stay with Gordy's girlfriend, Laura Steek. The arrangement provided Tara with a stable, supportive environment as she navigated the transition to adulthood. Tara was learning to be independent while still having access to people who cared about her welfare. The weekend visits with Laura gave Tara another positive female role model and provided respite from the demands of college preparation and daily life. Tara was building a network of support that would help her succeed despite the challenges her trauma presented. Tara's curiosity about the 10 months of captivity had grown as she matured. Time had mostly erased those memories from her conscious recollection. Trauma, especially trauma experienced at a very young age, is sometimes blocked from memory. The brain protects itself by not allowing full conscious access to experiences too overwhelming to process. Tara remembered fragments, feelings, sensations, disconnected images, but she did not have a narrative memory of those 10 months. As an 18-year-old, Tara wanted to know what had happened to her. She believed understanding the full story would be good for her continued healing. This desire to know, even about terrible things, reflected Tara's strength and her commitment to not letting the trauma define her. The case files from Tara's kidnapping contained details that adults had protected her from knowing when she was younger. Police reporters described the conditions in the van, the abuse documented in photographs and films, the testimony of Macklin and William Marston. As Tara prepared to enter adulthood, she wanted access to this information. She wanted to understand as fully as possible what had been done to her. Some people questioned whether this was healthy, whether revisiting such traumatic material might cause harm. But Tara's therapist generally supported her desire to know. Hidden trauma often festers and creates problems. Confronted directly, trauma loses some of its power. Tara's choice to learn about her captivity was an act of courage and a step toward full recovery. Tara also spoke publicly about the importance of talking about her experiences rather than hiding them. Some people had told her to stop discussing the kidnapping, saying it was over and she should move on. But Tara rejected that advice. She believed that talking about what happened helped her process it and helped others understand the reality of child abduction and abuse. By speaking openly, Tara also combated the shame that often silences survivors. She had done nothing wrong. She had been a victim. Refusing to hide her history was an act of defiance against the perpetrators who had tried to destroy her. The career aspirations Tara developed as she prepared for college reflected her experiences and her desire to help others. She was interested in psychology and social work, fields that would allow her to support people dealing with trauma. Tara understood from personal experience what it felt like to be a survivor. She could empathize with trauma victims in ways that people who had not experienced severe trauma could not. Turning her suffering into something that could help others would give meaning to what she had endured. This transformation from victim to advocate to helper is a pattern seen in many survivors who successfully heal from trauma. Tara's relationship with her biological family remained strong. Steve and Elizabeth Burke had supported their daughter through 15 years of recovery. They had attended therapy sessions, learned how to respond to Tara's triggers and fears, and created a home environment where Tara felt safe. Jeremy, Tara's brother, had also been part of the family's healing process. The entire family had been affected by the kidnapping and its aftermath. They had worked together to overcome the trauma and rebuild their lives. The Burke family's experience demonstrated that healing from trauma is often a family project, not just an individual one. Financial stability remained a challenge for the Burke family. Steve's piano tuning business never fully recovered from the loss of clients after Tara's case became public. The family had stretched their finances to pay for therapy beyond what victim services funding covered. They had dealt with the costs of raising a child with special needs resulting from trauma. Gordy's fundraising efforts for Tara's college education helped significantly, but money remained a source of stress. The Burke family would have preferred to focus entirely on Tara's healing rather than worrying about finances, but the reality was that recovery from trauma costs money and resources are often limited. The broader impact of Tara's case extended beyond her personal recovery. Her kidnapping and rescue had occurred during a period when American society was becoming more aware of child abduction and abuse. The 1980s saw increased attention to missing children, leading to initiatives like Amber Alerts, national registries of sex offenders, and better protocols for investigating child abuse. Tara's case contributed to this growing awareness. The details of her captivity and abuse shocked people and prompted discussions about how to better protect children. While Tara's suffering was terrible, the policy changes and increased vigilance that followed potentially prevented other children from experiencing similar fates. McLean's reward money from the city of Concord had been held in trust until he turned 18. When Mac came of age, he received the money with interest. The reward recognized his bravery in escaping and leading police to Tara. Without Mac's courage, Tara might have died in that van. Mac had endured 8 months of captivity, had been beaten and abused, and had still found the strength to escape and seek help. His heroism deserved recognition. But money could not undo the trauma Mac had experienced. He faced his own recovery journey, and his outcomes received less public attention than Tara's. Louis Tree Frog Johnson remained in California State Prison serving his 527-year sentence. He would never be released. He would die in prison, which was the only appropriate outcome for someone who had committed such heinous crimes against children. Johnson's case became a reference point in discussions about sentencing for child abuse. The 527-year sentence sent a message that society viewed crimes against children as deserving of the harshest possible punishments. Whether such extreme sentences actually deter future crimes remains debated, but they provide a sense of justice for victims and their families. Alex Cabarga also remained imprisoned, serving his 200-year sentence. Cabarga's situation remained complicated. He had been both a victim of Johnson and a perpetrator against Tara and Mac. The legal system had held him accountable for his crimes while acknowledging his own victimization. Whether Cabarga used his time in prison to genuinely rehabilitate himself or whether he remained a dangerous predator was unclear. The psychological evaluation ordered at his sentencing had recommended treatment. Whether Cabarga engaged meaningfully with that treatment and achieved any real change was information not generally available to the public. This issue of how much victims' families should know about perpetrators' lives in prison sparked debate. Should the Burkes be informed if Cabarga participated in therapy and made progress? Should they have input if he ever became eligible for parole? The trend in victims' rights during the 1980s and 90s was toward giving victims and their families more information and more voice in decisions about offenders. But balancing victims' rights with offenders' rights remained complicated. Tara and her family had a right to know if the men who had hurt her might someday be released. But Cabarga and Johnson also had some rights to privacy and to rehabilitation attempts. Tara Burke's story continued beyond her teenage years into adulthood. She successfully enrolled at San Jose State University with the support of Lieutenant Gordy and the scholarships he helped arrange. College represented a new chapter in Tara's life, an opportunity to define herself through her choices and achievements rather than being defined solely by what had been done to her as a child. Tara studied psychology, drawn to understanding the human mind and how people recover from trauma. Her personal experience gave her insights that textbooks alone could never provide. She understood the complex emotions survivors face, the challenges of rebuilding trust, the long-term effects of childhood trauma. The transition to college life presented challenges for Tara beyond the academic demands most students face. Being away from home, even partially, required managing anxiety without immediate access to her support system. Meeting new people meant deciding how much to share about her history. Some new acquaintances would eventually learn who Tara was and what had happened to her. Their reactions varied. Some people were supportive and compassionate. Others were uncomfortable or voyeuristic, treating Tara as a curiosity rather than a person. Tara learned to navigate these social dynamics, deciding on a case-by-case basis how much to reveal and when. Tara's commitment to helping others who had experienced trauma strengthened during her college years. She volunteered with organizations supporting child abuse survivors. She shared her story when she felt it might help others, demonstrating that recovery was possible even after severe trauma. Tara became an advocate for improved victim services, particularly increased funding for therapy. Her family's experience of running out of therapy funding just as Tara needed it most had shown her the gaps in the system. She worked to raise awareness about the long-term costs of trauma treatment and the inadequacy of funding caps that bore no relationship to actual treatment needs. Lieutenant Gordy's role in Tara's life evolved as she became an adult. He was no longer managing her daily welfare as he had when she was younger, but he remained a steady presence, someone Tara could turn to for advice and support. Gordy attended Tara's college graduation, proud of what she had accomplished. The little girl whose photograph he had carried for 10 months had become a college graduate preparing to make a difference in the world. For Gordy, Tara's success validated his belief that even the most traumatized children could heal and thrive with proper support and encouragement. Tara's relationship with her biological family remained close. The Burke family had weathered terrible storms together. The kidnapping and its aftermath had tested them in ways most families never face. They had emerged with strong bonds and deep appreciation for each other. Family gatherings were precious to them in ways that people who had not experienced such loss might not fully understand. Having Tara safe and present at family celebrations was never taken for granted. Every holiday, every birthday, every ordinary Sunday dinner was a gift, because they knew how easily Tara could have been lost forever. The lasting effects of the trauma manifested in various ways as Tara moved through adulthood. She experienced anxiety in certain situations, enclosed spaces, being alone in unfamiliar places, meeting men who reminded her in some way of Johnson or Cabarga. These triggers could not always be predicted or avoided. Tara learned to manage them through therapy and coping strategies, but they never completely disappeared. Trauma rewires the brain in ways that persist even after conscious memories fade. Tara's nervous system remained hypervigilant, always scanning for threats even when she intellectually knew she was safe. Romantic relationships presented particular challenges. Intimacy required trust and vulnerability, both of which had been violated during Tara's captivity. She had to work through complicated feelings about physical touch, about allowing someone close to her, about letting down her guard. Not all of her relationships succeeded. Some partners struggled to understand the lasting effects of childhood trauma or became frustrated when Tara's triggers interfered with the relationship. But Tara persisted, believing she deserved love and partnership despite her history. Finding someone who could accept her completely, trauma and all, became an important goal. The case that had begun in February 1982 gradually faded from public consciousness as years passed. New crimes captured media attention. People moved on. But for Tara, the case never truly ended. She carried it with her in her body's reactions, in her therapeutic work, in her advocacy for other survivors. The 10 months of captivity had shaped who she became even as she worked to not let it define her entirely. Tara's challenge was integrating her trauma into her identity without allowing it to be her only identity. She was a survivor, yes, but she was also a student, a daughter, a friend, an advocate, a woman with interests and dreams beyond her traumatic past. Louis Johnson died in prison, though the exact date of his death was not widely publicized. He spent decades incarcerated, dying without ever expressing genuine remorse for what he had done to Tara, Mac, and Alex. Johnson's death meant one threat was permanently removed from the world. He could never hurt another child. For Tara, Johnson's death brought mixed feelings: relief that he was gone, anger that he had lived as long as he did when he had stolen so much from others, disappointment that he had never acknowledged the full harm he caused or provided closure through honest disclosure of everything he had done. Alex Cabarga's fate in the prison system received less attention. He remained incarcerated, serving his 200-year sentence. Whether he would ever be released on parole seemed unlikely given the nature of his crimes and the length of his sentence. Cabarga's complex status as both victim and perpetrator continued to generate discussion among people who studied criminal justice. His case raised questions about culpability when a defendant has been groomed and abused by the person who then uses them to abuse others. There are no easy answers to these questions, and Cabarga's case illustrated the gray areas in criminal justice that textbooks rarely capture. McLean's life after receiving his reward money at age 18 remained largely private. He had been the hero who saved Tara's life, but he also carried his own trauma from 8 months of captivity and abuse. Whether Max successfully healed and built a satisfying adult life, or whether he struggled with lasting effects of his trauma, was information not readily available. The public focus on Tara's recovery meant Mac's journey received less attention, which may have been a blessing, or may have meant he lacked the support Tara received. The disparity in how the two child victims were treated after rescue raised questions about which stories get told and which survivors receive resources and attention. Tara's advocacy work expanded as she gained education and life experience. She spoke at conferences about childhood trauma. She consulted with law enforcement agencies about interviewing child victims. She provided training to therapists working with abuse survivors. Tara's willingness to share her story and her expertise helped countless other people. Every child victim who received better treatment because professionals learned from Tara's experience represented a positive legacy emerging from terrible suffering. Tara transformed her pain into purpose, demonstrating resilience and strength that inspired others. The butterfly symbolism that Tara embraced reflected her journey from captivity to freedom, from trauma to healing, from victim to survivor to advocate. Butterflies undergo complete metamorphosis, emerging from the cocoon fundamentally transformed. Tara had undergone her own metamorphosis. The little girl found terrified in a van had become a woman, determined to help others and to live fully despite what had been done to her. Her story was ultimately one of hope, not the naive hope that trauma can be erased, but the realistic hope that healing is possible, that people can survive terrible things and still build meaningful lives. Before we end, I want to ask you to do something important. If Tara's story has moved you, if you believe every child deserves protection and every survivor deserves support, please hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel so these critical stories reach more people who need to hear them. And I really want to know, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below. Are you a survivor yourself finding hope in Tara's recovery? Do you work with trauma victims and see yourself in this story? Your engagement helps keep these stories visible, supports survivors who need to know they're not alone, and reminds us all why protecting children must be everyone's priority. Share Tara's story. Let people know that healing is possible even after the worst trauma. Let them know that survivors can thrive with proper support. Thank you for watching, thank you for caring, and thank you for being part of a community that refuses to look away from difficult truths.